This busy stretch of road is a modern highway providing travelers with speedy access to work, shopping, entertainment, or home. Many people drive this roadway every day without more than a passing thought as to how this road came to be here and what it meant to the pioneers who came before them. It may not have the romantic allure of a Dixie Highway, Lincoln Road, or Route 66, but the importance of Route 68 cannot be overlooked. Route 68 ties the Ohio River and the Great Lakes together. It also served as a major thoroughfare on the Underground Railroad. For thousands of fugitive slaves, it was the road to freedom. The journey to freedom was just a few days of hunger and hard travel along a well-established road of stations from the home of John Rankin in Ripley, Ohio, to the Park House on the corner of Rankin and Delahousie Streets in Amherstburg, Canada. Fugitives would begin their journey from Ripley on the north side of the Ohio River over nearly 150 miles to its end in Findlay. Of the many thousands who drive along this highway today, very few know of its significance as a major route on the Underground Railroad and its importance in American history. Route 68 was not the only road to freedom through Ohio. Many of the underground roads were already established Indian roads or trails to the hunting grounds in Kentucky and back. Some traced their beginnings to Cincinnati, where the Miami Indian Trail followed the Miami Indian River north through villages in Dayton, Wapakoneta, Lima, and on to Findlay and Toledo. State Route 68 merges with Route 25 and Interstate 75 just north of Findlay at Signet, where it again becomes designated as Route 25 and runs through Bowling Green and Perrysburg to Toledo. Since the beginning of slavery in America, there have been thousands of attempts to escape to the freedom of the North. Before the states were established, slaves fled to the safety of Indian villages in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Florida. Some slaves established their own settlements in hidden swamps or the dark primeval swampland north of Findlay. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law as efforts to abolish the practice of slavery grew. As a result, abolitionists organized a secret system to smuggle runaways from their slaveholders to the safety of the North. In the early years, crossing the Ohio River was considered safe. However, as the number of slaves increased, the slave owners began offering rewards for the return of their property. Often, teams of slave catchers pursued or ambushed runaways for the bounty.
They uncovered in the basement or cellar of this barn or structure, whatever it was, chains that were and shackles that were mounted into the walls in the underpinnings of this place, and it is claimed that this was a holding pen that bounty hunters would use because it wouldn't, for example, it wouldn't be profitable to catch one runaway in Greene County and then take him back to Kentucky or wherever. But it might be a little more profitable if I had 5, 6, 7, or 8.
The effort to aid the slaves seeking freedom became more sophisticated and by necessity more covert. Ohio was no longer a safe refuge. Soon, Ontario, Canada became the destination of fugitives seeking freedom. This path was originally called the Underground Road, when Tice Davis, a slave, disappeared after crossing the Ohio River. After arriving in Ripley, his master could not find Tice, and so he declared that he must have disappeared on an underground road. It later became known as the Underground Railroad as trains became more commonplace as a mode of transportation. The train station comparisons included references to stations where fugitives stopped for protection, rest, and sustenance. In addition, conductors provided a transfer to the next stop. Many churches were also used to provide sanctuary for runaways. From the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, to the Quakers. Churches and their members played a key role in helping fugitives reach their destination. Often, the members or family of one church would initiate and build another church in a neighboring village in an attempt to provide shorter distances between stops.
And the AME was probably the only affiliation that they had at that time. And each settlement did not have a minister as such. Most of them had itinerant or circuit riders. And I'm sure that news of movement, the needs for money, shipments, and whatever was passed from community to community by these preachers who happened to be AME.
As the routes developed and became more sophisticated, everything from hidden rooms and walls, false floors, attics, caves, or crude shelters would serve as needed protection. A runaway or fugitive traveled nearly 275 miles after crossing the Ohio River at Ripley. Often, fugitives would first encounter John Parker, a free black man, who would have them taken to Reverend John Rankin's home, which is on the highest peak of Ripley, overlooking the Ohio River, with Kentucky bordering the southern shore. After leaving Reverend Rankin's house, fugitives would travel north to the Presbyterian Church at Red Oak, a free black settlement and one of the first anti-slavery societies formed in Ohio. Fugitives would continue their journey along General Hull's Trace north to Dr. Isaac Beck's home in Sardina, or to hide at Reverend Mahan's at the Sardina Presbyterian Church. They would travel northward to a Quaker meeting house at Buford, or to the home of Christopher Betts at Martinsville. From there, they pushed onward to Wilmington, Xenia, and Selma in Clark County. Arriving in Springfield, fugitives would seek refuge at the Gammon House, or the Women's Club. They were nearly halfway through Ohio and almost to freedom.
Okay, Lewis Adams was born in May of 1785, and our records indicate near Louisville. He had 12 children, 10 of whom survived to adulthood and then went on to have their own families. My connection to Rita is my direct ancestor, William Adams, was the oldest child, and he was a brother to David Adams.
In 1826, David Adams was born in Champaign County. David lived in Urbana until he was 21 years of age, where he served as a barber. In 1848, he moved to Springfield, where he met and married his wife, Elizabeth Conaway. They later moved to Findlay to start a new life together.
The church, the AME church, there in Urbana in 1824, he and his in-laws and the Gammon family and a lady named Fanny Carter, they were charter members of St. Paul, so he was quite religious, I would say, but I don't know that he was ever a practicing minister.
With a solid foundation of Adams family members establishing AME churches in Springfield and Urbana, the AME church became an important connection on the Underground Railroad.
And there was some collateral family relationships with the Adamses and some of the other early African American settlers that were in Arlington and Dunkirk, I believe. So you can see that there is a, even though the Underground Railroad is documented as private and secretive and a loose organization, you can see a thread of familial connections coming at least from Clark County up to Findlay.
One stop was outside of West Liberty. The Pioneer House was built in 1828 by Judge Benjamin Piatt and his wife Elizabeth Barnett, who moved into the area from Cincinnati. The judge was obliged to uphold the law, but his wife was an avowed abolitionist. Soon their home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. When the judge was away from home, Mrs. Piatt would place in front of the house a freedom flag to signal to the fugitives that it was safe to enter her home. Fugitives would leave the safe retreat of Mrs. Piatt and proceed toward Mechanicsburg and Northwood.
For example, the Addison White story in Mechanicsburg, where Addison White, a runaway from Flemingsburg, Kentucky, was finally caught up with and caught and being ready to take back to Kentucky. Well, there was a shooting incident. The slave master and the federal marshals that came to pick Addison White up and take him back to Kentucky were attacked by the citizens of Mechanicsburg. The sheriff of Clark County, John Layton, got involved in it. There was a big to-do. They retook Addison White from the marshals, brought him back to Mechanicsburg. The city raised enough money to pay for his freedom, $900 and some.
Leaving Mount Victory to the north, past Kenton, fugitives would be met by John Woods from Williamstown, just south of Arlington.
His ancestor, John Alexander Woods, was one of the conductors of the Underground Railroad in Hancock County. His farm was located about a mile north of Williamstown, and there was an article that his son had written. He told the story of how he had conducted a family of three into Findlay, and how he had eluded some of the slave catchers that were after them. And these people were moved at night, sometimes by horse, sometimes up a river if there was one handy, and they were usually hidden in the barn or in a shed or maybe in a cellar. And then as soon as it was safe, they would move them on to the next station, and in the case of Arlington, that was usually Findlay, going toward Findlay.
Throughout Hancock County, both black and white people risked their personal freedom, reputation, and possessions to assist slaves. Local conductors such as Henry Bigelow, R.B. Hurd, David Adams, and Joel Markle took this risk to assist fugitives toward freedom.
He was a very close friend to Judge Corey, who was a very prominent person there in Findlay, and in fact he named his son Corey, who was my grandfather.
This is what I know of what was termed the Grapevine Telegraph, an underground railway through Hancock County. In May 1854, as memory serves me, I arrived in Findlay, Ohio, and became actively engaged in a business on the corner of Main and Main cross streets in this city. I soon made acquaintances of the many farmers of the county and quite a number who hailed from Richland and Ashland counties. Among the others was a respected citizen, Uncle John King, who lived and owned the farm 3½ miles north of town on Perrysburg Road. Our old acquaintance being renewed, he sounded my sentiments on the slavery question. I frankly told him that I was somewhat pro-slavery in sentiment, yet I had a horror of many of the doings in southern slave-holding states, and while I had no intention to interfere with the institution of slavery in the state where it existed by law, yet I would not aid a slave owner in capturing a runaway. Well, this was just what my friend wished to know, and in the course of several talks with him, and his reliance on my sentiments expressed, told me of an organization that was in existence styled the Underground Railroad, to aid refugees who were fleeing from slavery to Canada and freedom, and asked me to contribute what aid I felt like doing to keep up steam and pay the engineer, fireman, and conductor on the popular line, which I gladly assented to do.
Well, I know at one time he had a barbershop in the basement of one of the older city halls, and then he moved over on Main Street. So he was located in a number of places.
I came to Findlay in October 1848. I would get a note to be sent south of Chamberlain Hill, 2 miles south of Findlay, to meet passengers. I never knew the parties or conductors. Sometimes one, sometimes another would bring the fugitives to the place agreed upon. At the edge of the woods, I'd find the passengers and then would run them out to Old Man King's, 9 miles north, and leave them there till the next night, and then go and get them on to Perrysburg, 36 miles. I used to deliver them to a barber in town, who in turn turned them over to William Merrington on the other side of the Maumee River. Generally from there they were forwarded across the Michigan line. We used to take them different ways. I would sometimes, when the way was clear, disguise them and take them to Sandusky City aboard the Mad River Railroad. I remember I took one fella, kind of feminine looking fella, and made him dress and took him through as my lady. My father lived in Urbana about 1829 or 30. We had 7 at our house at one time. The fugitives were just eating breakfast when their owners were spied 100 yards away. The folks had just time to hide the fugitives in the hole under the puncheon floor made of potatoes. The table was pulled back over the boards just in time. The slave catchers hunted the house over 2 or 3 times. My grandfather was a shrewd kind of fellow and pretended to help hunt. Finally, they hired him at $2 a day to go to Sandusky with them. We kept the fugitives until he got back and sent the hunters off in the direction of Xenia. Then, with the money thus obtained, the fugitives were sent to Sandusky, and their way to Canada was paid with their master's own money.
I was born in Toronto, Canada, September 18, 1818. I was in my 12th year when I left there, and have lived in Hancock County, Ohio, 51 years. From 1854 to 1855, I lived south 10 miles at Arlington, a new place then, only a few farmers living there. According to the best of my information, the Underground Railroad began to run through on the Bellefontaine and Perrysburg Road. It went to Perrysburg, crossed the river there, and on to Toledo. I don't know where the road did begin at Bellefontaine or down below there at Urbana. The work ran along clear up to the war to 1861, or even up to 1862. Once in a while, one came along after the war commenced. The stations were Dunkirk, just south of Arlington, Smith on the edge of Dunkirk, James Woods, 5 miles north of Smith, Dr. Beach at Arlington, my father-in-law, and then Findlay. There was no one between Findlay and Arlington. Ezra Brown, David Adams, R.B. Hurd, Robert Struthers, there were 10 or 15 in town or just on the edge of town. About 4 miles north of Findlay was an old man, John King. Then north of that was Bowling Green. They would come sometimes 1 or 2 a week, sometimes once a month, sometimes 6 or 7. I think 7 was the highest number that came together. After the fugitive slave law, they came in a good deal thicker.
They had the fugitive slave law. They could come up here, and if they could make claim to the slaves, they'd have to let them go and take them back south. And Rush Sloan was one of them that fought tooth and nail to hide them in different places.
I used to keep fugitives in my garret, and when I made a trip, Dr. Beach, Hugh Newell, Henry Porch, and David Corey acted specially to gallant me out of town and see me safely through to the bridge. I never carried less than 2. North of Bowling Green, there was 1 station. In Maumee City, I think, I used to bring them in Findlay here in a wagon. I would throw in a few bags of oats or a little hay. Absalom P. Bile was U.S. Deputy Marshal here about 54 or 55 under Pierce. He was a good one, and when the hunters came here, they'd get him, and they were sure to find them then. He was an old settler here and knew us all, and he'd taken them where the fugitives wasn't. One day I was coming in with 4 in broad daylight and had told the boys to sit up and get some air when Bile came along. I knew him well, but didn't look at him, and he never saw us. He looked way off. In 55 or 56, I had 16 here in one body. They came from Virginia. They were shipped in while I was away and were taken to old Robert Struthers about a half-mile off the road down the River Blanchard on the north side. They were kept in his big barn for 3 days. Some of our good friends' white ladies worked near all night getting ready clothes for them. Then I got a couple of two-horse wagons and drove them to Perrysburg, where they were taken off our hands. I had a letter afterwards which said that they had gotten through safely.
The method of operation was mostly by horsepower in the night. They did not communicate with each other and those we knew to be all right by innuendos. No names mentioned, so no one could give evidence of a witness against anybody that might be in jeopardy. Our farms and our property were in danger. Those kept in various stations were in danger of detection and were taken forward as fast as possible in larger or smaller number. Henry Bigelow started from Findlay in 1852 and was with a load of 8 or 10 fugitives in the evening. The roads were bad in the fall, and when he was about 14 miles on his way, it was most morning. Not venturing to go on in the daylight, he was in a dilemma, but he was equal to the occasion, as you will see. During the Wildcat Mania some years before, the land speculators laid out towns on paper in many parts of the country with which to get even with the money kings in the East. They had planned one which they gave the fitting name Woodbury. It was in the woods in the wettest part of the Black Swamp. They cleared off an acre or two right off the main road from Findlay to Perrysburg and built a fair-sized 2-story frame house. There was no inhabitant nearer than 1 mile. This house was getting somewhat dilapidated and had been only occasionally occupied for some years. Well, Mr. Bigelow sorted his precious load in the upper rooms. He took his horse and wagon a short distance into the woods and returned nearer to the place where he had hidden his dusky wards and spent the day gathering hickory nuts. During the day, persons passing near heard unusual noises in the house, which got circulated in the neighborhoods, and the Black Swampers verily believed the old building was haunted, and for many years it was called and looked upon as the haunted house, till finally it was burned down. In the evening, Mr. Bigelow loaded up and took his consignment to safe quarters, and we afterward arrived safe in Canada.
The journey from Findlay to Bowling Green was not easy. With slave hunters on their trail, the voyage became more intense as the fugitives would pass through a great black swamp north of Findlay. The mud on the trail and the high water in the streams made traveling difficult most of the year. The black swamp was all but impassable with deep mud, brackish water, and a dark canopy of tall oaks that blackened the sky. Only a tomahawk blaze on a tree would guide one through the thick maze of vegetation. Some fugitives were lucky to avoid the Black Swamp to Bowling Green by taking the Mad River Railroad from Findlay to Sandusky.
Well, they had one stream that come by way of Castaic, Venice, and then into Sandusky, and that stream operated out of which is now the Second Baptist Church.
Leaving for Sandusky, fugitives were led through Tiffin and Venice to the Second Baptist Church, where they could purchase a one-way ticket to Canada aboard a passenger steamer. If it was too problematic to get passage on a steamer from the Sandusky docks, fugitives were guided to the Jabez home in Huron and concealed in a dark cellar. The cellar was outfitted with a tunnel leading north to the beach, where a rowboat would take them to a steamer waiting offshore. However, depending upon availability of a secure route to ensure safe passage, fugitives' options could change daily. If they could not make it to Sandusky, their best option was through the dreadful Black Swamp to Bowling Green. And once in Bowling Green, fugitives were taken to the House of Three Pines for a brief reprieve. When it was safe to travel again, they departed for Perrysburg on the Erie Canal or up Route 25, hidden in a wagon. Once in Perrysburg, fugitives were provided housing at the House of Four Pillars, located off the Erie Canal along the Maumee River. Though the port of Toledo provided many safe havens along its banks, fugitives could book passage on a ferry to Leamington or Amherstburg, Ontario, Canada. When it was too dangerous to board the steamers, fugitives hiked further north to Monroe, Michigan, where they crossed the Detroit River to Boblo Island, where they were able to see Canada, their final destination. By this point, they had traveled over a week, 275 miles through Ohio and Michigan to reach the Park House in Amherstburg, Ontario, Canada. Once in the sanctuary of the Park House, fugitives rejoiced, they relaxed, and then they prepared for their trip to the Church of the Nazarene, their final march to freedom. This was an AME church built by free slaves who escaped north to aid others who were dodging ruthless slave masters.
Well, you know, I think there's this image that, that Afro-Americans were not participants in the Underground Railroad. You get the opinion that primarily most of the conductors were probably whites, abolitionists, and etc. And we don't have that history shared, that Afro-Americans were very much a part of the Underground Railroad.
Many men and women, as conductors of the Underground Railroad, risked their personal freedom, reputation, and possessions to assist fugitive slaves. Abolitionists and former slaves, whose names we might recognize today, joined together to end the unjust practice of slavery and to promote the cause of freedom. It is amazing that not one slave was left behind or captured while escaping to their freedom along Ohio's Route 68. From the village of Ripley on the Ohio River to Rankin Street in Amherstburg, Canada, on the shore of the Detroit River, Route 68 was the route that led many slaves to freedom and to a better life.